6,000 defenders against 40,000 invaders. A tiny Mediterranean island against the most powerful empire on earth. May 18th, 1565, the Ottoman war machine descends on Malta with 193 ships. Their mission: wipe the Knights Hospitaller from existence. But what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object, when Europe's last crusading order refuses to die? The answer lies in 113 days of blood, stone, and gunpowder that changed the course of history. You think you know siege warfare? Think again. Malta wasn't just another fortress falling to Ottoman expansion. This was personal. Suleiman the Magnificent had already crushed these knights on Rhodes 43 years earlier, driven them from their island stronghold after 6 months of bombardment. Now he wanted to finish what he started: eliminate Christianity's most dangerous pirates once and for all. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Francisco Balbi di Correggio's eyewitness account published in 1568, and Giacomo Bosio's official order records from 1588. These are primary sources written by men who were there, not modern speculation. Now back to the information. The Knights Hospitaller had settled Malta in 1530. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V gave them the barren island for 1 falcon per year and a mass on All Saints' Day. It seemed like charity. The emperor also dumped Tripoli on them, a poisoned gift on the North African coast. But Malta's position made it deadly, 60 miles south of Sicily, dead center of the Mediterranean's main shipping lane. Every Ottoman vessel traveling east to west had to pass within sight of Maltese watchtowers. Jean Parisot de Lavalette became Grand Master in 1557. Born 1595 into French nobility, spoke Italian, Spanish, Greek, Arabic, Turkish, had fought at Rhodes as a young knight. Now 70 years old and harder than the limestone cliffs of his island fortress. By early 1565, his spy network in Constantinople was sending urgent warnings. The attack was coming, March 22nd, 1565. The Ottoman Armada set sail from the Golden Horn, 159 warships under Admiral Piali Pasha, 40,000 troops under Mustafa Pasha, the elite Janissary Corps, artillery train with massive siege cannons, supply vessels carrying months of provisions. This wasn't a raid, this was total war, but command was split 3 ways. Suleiman's fatal mistake: Piale commanded the fleet. Mustafa led the army. Both were ordered to defer to Dragut Reis when he arrived from Tripoli. Dragut was the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean. 68 years old, had raided Malta 7 times between 1540 and 1565, knew every bay, every cave, every weakness in the fortifications. May 18th, 1565. Dawn breaks over Marsaxlokk Harbor. Maltese lookouts count the sails. 193 ships, 40,000 men, the greatest Ottoman expedition since the conquest of Rhodes. Against them, 600 knights, 8,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, 500 Maltese militia, 9,000 defenders total, 4-to-1 odds. But Lavalette had been preparing for 5 years. A Fort St. Elmo guarded the entrance to Grand Harbor, built on Mount Siberus in 1552, star-shaped bastion designed by Spanish engineer Pedro Pardo. Lavalette knew the Ottomans would attack St. Elmo first, had to secure the harbor for their fleet, so he gambled everything, moved half his heavy artillery into the fort, concentrated his best gunners behind those walls. Piali wanted to attack St. Elmo immediately. Mustafa preferred to take Medina first, then assault the coastal forts by land. They argued for days while the fleet anchored offshore. Finally, Mustafa relented, believed St. Elmo would fall in 3 days. Ottoman engineers had calculated the fortress could not withstand their bombardment. They were wrong. May 27th, the bombardment began. 36 cannons on higher ground, round-the-clock artillery fire that could be heard in Sicily. St. Elmo's walls crumbled, but every night, Lavalette sent boats across the harbor, evacuated the wounded, brought fresh troops, repaired the damage. The fort held June 3rd. Turkish janissaries seized the outer ravelin, hand-to-hand fighting in the ditches. Captain Gonzalo de Medrano sent word to Lavalette. St. Elmo could not hold. Lavalette's reply was ice cold. The fort must hold until the relief force arrives. No retreat, no surrender. Fight until the last man. June 15th. Dragut arrived with 13 galleys from Tripoli. The old corsair took one look at St. Elmo's battered walls and knew the truth. This fortress was costing too much. Half the Janissary Corps was already dead or wounded. But Suleiman's orders were clear. Take the fort. June 18th. Dragut was arguing with Turkish gunners about their aim. The cannons were firing too high, missing the walls, hitting empty air. At Dragut's insistence, they lowered the trajectory. The shot flew true. Hit the fortress wall, but the impact dislodged part of the Turkish trench. Stone and earth cascaded down. Struck Dragut in the head, killed him instantly. Some sources say it was a lucky shot from Fort St. Angelo. Either way, the greatest Ottoman admiral was dead. June 23rd. After 31 days of siege, St. Elmo fell. Every defender dead except 9 badly wounded men. But the cost was staggering. 6,000 Ottoman casualties, half the Janissary Corps wiped out. Mustafa Pasha was so enraged he ordered the knights' bodies decapitated, floated their corpses across the harbor on mock crucifixes. La Valette's response was Arctic, had all Turkish prisoners beheaded, loaded their heads into his cannons, fired them into the Ottoman camp. Message received. This would be a war without quarter. July 2nd, Piccolo Soccorso. The small relief. 700 men landed at St. Paul's Bay, Spanish and Italian volunteers. They slipped past Ottoman patrols, reinforced Birgu and Senglea, not enough to change the odds, but enough to raise morale. Mustafa now turned his attention to the main fortifications. Fort St. Angelo at Birgu, Fort St. Michael at Sengla, 3 kilometers of defensive walls, bastions and demi-bastions carved from solid rock. This was where La Valette made his stand, 70 years old, fighting with pike in hand, leading charges against Ottoman assault troops. August 7th, the great assault on Senglea. Ottoman engineers built a massive siege tower, leather-covered, fire-resistant, water tanks inside to douse flames, moved on rollers toward the walls, but the Maltese had hidden artillery inside the fortifications, concealed cannons loaded with chain shot. When the tower came within range, they opened fire, destroyed it completely. Ottoman assault collapsed. August 18th, breach in the walls of Birgu. Ottoman troops poured through, hand-to-hand, fighting in the streets. La Valette himself charged into the melee. Pike thrust, sword stroke, leading from the front. The attack seemed successful, then disaster. A small force of Maltese cavalry struck the Ottoman rear, only 60 horsemen led by Captain Miranda. But Mustafa's commanders panicked, thought it was the vanguard of a massive relief army, ordered retreat. The breach was sealed. September 7th, Don Garcia de Toledo finally landed the Grande Soccorso, 8,000 Spanish and Italian troops at St. Paul's Bay. The great relief force Spain had promised for months. But Mustafa still outnumbered them. 40,000 Ottomans, 8,000 reinforcements, 14,000 total Christian forces, still outmanned. But the Ottomans were exhausted, diseased, demoralized, fighting far from home. September 8th, the final battle. Ottoman forces advanced toward the relief camp, met Spanish squares on the ridge of San Paul Tat Targa, arquebusiers, pikemen, disciplined volleys. The Turkish charge broke. Routed, Mustafa ordered general retreat. 4 months of siege, 25,000 Ottoman casualties. The invasion had failed. September 13th, the last Ottoman ships disappeared over the horizon, left behind 15,000 dead, heavy artillery abandoned, the greatest military disaster in Ottoman history since their empire began. Malta had held. Christian Europe was saved. The tide of Islamic expansion finally turned, but the true horror was in the numbers. Malta's population before the siege, 20,000, after 13,000, 7,000 civilians dead, massacred, worked to death as forced labor, 1/3 of the knights killed, 2,500 military casualties. The island had paid in blood. La Valette commissioned the new city of Valletta in 1566, built on Mount Siberas, where St. Elmo once stood, where the flower of the Turkish army had died trying to storm a fortress they thought would fall in days. The city that bears his name became Europe's strongest fortification, Humilissima Civitas Vallettae, the most humble city of Valletta, though contemporaries called it Superbissima. The most proud, Pope Pius IV offered La Valette a cardinal's hat. He refused, wanted to maintain the order's independence. King Philip II sent congratulations. 300 European nobles traveled to Malta to offer their services. Voltaire later wrote, "Nothing is better known than the Siege of Malta." But Suleiman the Magnificent never recovered from the defeat. Died the following year campaigning in Hungary, still obsessed with his failure. The psychology of siege warfare favored attackers. Defenders trapped behind walls, no escape, dwindling supplies. Ottoman strategy relied on this terror. Break the will before breaking the walls. But La Valette understood his enemy, had spent 40 years fighting Turks, knew their tactics, their weaknesses. The Knights Hospitaller were no ordinary soldiers, warrior monks, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. But their battlefield oath was simpler: death before dishonor. Each knight represented decades of training, languages, navigation, swordwork, artillery, engineering. When a knight died, Europe lost a weapon centuries in the making. Malta's terrain favored defense, limestone bedrock, natural harbors carved by millennia of waves, cliffs rising straight from the sea, only 3 possible landing sites: Grand Harbor, Marsamxett, St. Paul's Bay. La Valette fortified them all, every approach covered by interlocking fields of fire. The order's finances were crucial. Annual income, 80,000 ducats from European estates. Sounds impressive until you calculate siege costs. Gunpowder alone, 2 ducats per barrel. A single cannon shot cost what a common soldier earned in a week. Feeding 9,000 defenders for 4 months, 15,000 ducats, the siege consumed the order's entire treasury. Turkish logistics were staggering. 40,000 men required 40 tons of bread daily, 20 tons of meat, thousands of gallons of water. The Ottoman supply chain stretched 800 miles from Constantinople. One storm could sink months of provisions. Pirates could capture supply convoys. Distance became Malta's ally. Romegas was the order's most notorious corsair. Matherindo de Lescaut, born Gascony, 1525, joined the order at 20. By 1564, he commanded the fastest galley in the Mediterranean. June 1564, Romegas captured a merchant vessel belonging to the chief eunuch of Suleiman's seraglio. Cargo worth 80,000 ducats. Passengers included the governor of Cairo, the governor of Alexandria, Suleiman's daughter's former nurse, the perfect casus belli. Suleiman's rage was legendary. Ottoman chronicles record his exact words: "Either I will take Malta, or Malta will take my empire." Imperial decree issued October 1564. Every available ship, every elite regiment, the largest Ottoman expedition since the conquest of Rhodes. This wasn't just military strategy. This was personal vendetta. Ottoman siege artillery was revolutionary. Massive bronze cannons cast in Hungarian foundries, some weighing 12 tons, firing stone balls 4 feet in diameter, impact force that could shatter medieval walls like pottery. But moving these monsters required hundreds of oxen, specialized roads, permanent emplacements. They were devastating, but immobile. Maltese countermeasures were ingenious: night sorties to spike Turkish guns, hidden mines under Ottoman battery positions, chain shot loaded with scrap metal, heated cannonballs that set enemy siege equipment ablaze, Greek fire hurled from the walls, medieval technology enhanced by Renaissance innovation. The demographic impact was catastrophic. Malta's pre-siege population, 20,000. Post-siege, 13,000. 7,000 civilians killed, not just battle casualties. Systematic massacre. Ottoman policy since the conquest of Constantinople. Terrorize populations, break resistance through atrocity. But Malta's civilians fought back. Women and children hauled stones to repair breaches, carried water to gunners under enemy fire, treated wounded in underground hospitals carved from bedrock. Maltese historian Giovanni Bonello documented over 400 named civilian defenders, farmers who became soldiers, fishermen who became gunners, a population united by desperation. The Knights. Medical knowledge was advanced. Order tradition dating to the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, battlefield surgery, wound treatment, disease prevention. They understood that infection killed more men than enemy action, established field hospitals and cave systems, maintained surgical instruments, stockpiled medicinal herbs, knowledge that kept the garrison fighting. Weather became a factor by August. Mediterranean summer heat, no shade inside stone fortifications, water rationing. Turkish troops suffered worse, camped in open ground. No natural windbreaks, diseases spread through their camps. Dysentery, typhus, malaria from coastal marshes. Ottoman medical records list over 5,000 non-combat deaths. The naval dimension was complex. Ottoman fleet controlled the seas but couldn't eliminate Christian corsairs. Small, fast galleys slipped past Turkish patrols, carried messages to Sicily, brought ammunition and volunteers. Don Garcia's relief preparations depended on intelligence from these midnight runs. Every successful voyage shortened the siege. Spanish politics complicated relief efforts. Philip II ruled the largest empire in history: Americas, Netherlands, Italy, North Africa. Resources were finite. Priorities competed. The Netherlands were rebelling. French threats in the Pyrenees. Don Garcia needed royal permission for every soldier, every ship, every ducat. Bureaucracy while Malta burned. Fort St. Angelo was the key position, built on a rocky promontory jutting into Grand Harbor. Triangular layout maximizing firepower. Walls 8 feet thick. Interior chambers for ammunition storage. Underground cisterns holding 6 months' water supply. If St. Angelo fell, the siege was over. La Valette knew this, moved his headquarters inside the fort. The Order's intelligence network spanned Europe. merchant contacts in Constantinople, diplomatic sources in Venice, banking connections in Genoa. By February 1565, La Valette knew exact Ottoman fleet strength, troop numbers, artillery counts, departure dates. Battlefield of preparation replaced guesswork with scientific planning. Ottoman engineering was sophisticated. Siege lines with geometric precision. Approach trenches angled to avoid flanking fire. Battery positions calculated for maximum impact. Countermines to defeat Christian tunneling. Military architecture applied like mathematics. But mathematics couldn't account for human determination. Religious motivation transcended nationality. Spanish soldiers fought beside Italian mercenaries. Maltese farmers stood with French knights. Catholic volunteers arrived from across Europe. Protestant England sent weapons and money. Papal galleys carried ammunition. Christian unity forged by Ottoman threat. The siege's turning point came July 15th, middle of the campaign. Ottoman morale cracking, Dragut dead, janissaries decimated, supply lines stretched. Mustafa Pasha sent urgent dispatches to Constantinople, requested reinforcements, fresh troops, more artillery. Suleiman's reply was stark: take Malta or die trying. Turkish assault tactics evolved throughout the siege. Initial attacks relied on overwhelming firepower, massive bombardments followed by frontal assault. When this failed, they tried night attacks, surprise raids, mining operations, siege towers. Every method in the Ottoman playbook. None succeeded against prepared defenses and fanatical resistance. The economic impact reached across the Mediterranean. Maltese corsairs had been capturing 30 Turkish vessels annually, rich prizes, silk from Damascus, spices from Alexandria, slaves from the Black Sea. Total value, 200,000 ducats per year. The siege interrupted this commerce. Ottoman merchants lost fortunes. Insurance rates tripled. Trade routes shifted. Maltese folklore preserves siege memories. Stories passed through generations. Folk songs about heroes, legends of miraculous survival. Archaeological evidence confirms many details. Mass burial sites, cannonball impacts in limestone walls, sword fragments in rubble layers, popular memory validated by scientific investigation. The aftermath transformed Mediterranean geopolitics. Ottoman confidence shattered, Spanish prestige restored, papal influence revived, alliance patterns shifted. Venice reconsidered neutrality. France questioned Ottoman friendship. The balance of power tilted decisively toward Christian Europe. The siege changed everything, shattered Ottoman invincibility, proved the empire could be beaten, inspired the Holy League that would triumph at Lepanto 6 years later, saved Sicily, saved Italy, saved Christian Europe from Islamic conquest. All because 9,000 men refused to surrender a barren rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. Francisco Balbi di Correggio was there, Spanish arquebusier, kept a journal throughout the siege, published his eyewitness account in 1568. He wrote, "Malta of gold, Malta of silver, Malta of precious metal, we shall never take you. No, not even if you were as soft as a gourd, not even if you were only protected by an onion skin." But here's what the history books don't tell you. Archaeologists have found mass graves on Mount Sperras, exactly where Turkish assault troops fell during the siege of St. Elmo. Bone analysis confirms the trauma patterns. Sword cuts, cannonball impacts, arquebus wounds. The skeletons match Balbi's casualty reports. 6,000 Ottoman dead, all for a fortress that was supposed to fall in 3 days. The last knights died as they had lived, swords in hand, defending the faith. When the relief force finally arrived, they found St. Elmo's ruins carpeted with Turkish bodies. The knights' sacrifice had bought Europe 4 precious months. Time enough for Spain to assemble its armies, time enough for Christianity to survive. Malta had become the graveyard of the Ottoman navy, the place where Suleiman's dream of Mediterranean conquest died forever, where 6,000 defenders proved that courage could triumph over numbers, that faith could overcome fear, that even the mightiest empire could bleed.